The historical meaning of nirvana in early Buddhism. Night falls quietly on the world, whether we are ready or not. Cities glow, screens flicker, minds race on. Yet beneath all of this, something ancient stirs. A restlessness older than language. A tension that hums beneath ambition, beneath pleasure, beneath even our most tender loves. It is not dramatic. It is intimate. It is the simple fact of being alive and never quite at ease. Early Buddhism did not begin as a philosophy meant to decorate life. It arose as a response to this unease, not as an abstract puzzle, but as a lived wound. The Buddha did not speak first of heavens or metaphysics. He spoke of burning, of hearts on fire with wanting, fearing, clinging, resisting. And he spoke quietly and without spectacle of a way this fire could go out. The word nirvana has traveled far since then. It has been softened, romanticized, misunderstood, commercialized. In modern speech, it often means bliss, transcendence, escape, or eternal peace. A place to reach, a feeling to achieve, a reward at the end of effort. But in the early Buddhist world, the word carried a different gravity, a sharper simplicity, a meaning that did not promise fireworks but silence. To understand nirvana historically is not to strip it of mystery, but to return it to its original intimacy. It is to listen carefully to what early practitioners were actually seeking and what they were letting go of. It is to sit beside monks who owned nothing but a robe and a bowl, not because they despised life, but because they were listening so closely that even desire itself became audible. Tonight, we do not chase nirvana as an idea. We walk toward it as a question whispered through centuries of practice. What happens when craving ends? Not temporarily, not philosophically, but completely. The world that gave birth to nirvana. Northern India, around the 5th century before the Common Era, was a land alive with spiritual urgency. Forests were not empty places. They were classroom. Roads carried not only traders, but renunciants, men and women who had turned away from household life, not out of despair, but out of a deep suspicion that ordinary happiness was fragile and incomplete. The air was thick with questions about rebirth, karma, liberation, and the meaning of suffering. To understand the historical meaning of nirvana in early Buddhism, we must first step into the world in which the word was spoken, not as scholars, but as human beings breathing that ancient air. What he heard was not only the pain of poverty or illness or death. He heard the subtle dissatisfaction that survived even pleasure, the tension that returned after joy, the thirst that followed fulfillment like a shadow. This was not a moral failing. It was structural, built into the way the mind grasped experience. The Buddha emerged from this landscape not as a rebel shouting against tradition, but as a listener who had listened too deeply to ignore what he heard. In this world, liberation was already a known pursuit. Ascetics starved themselves. Yogis held their breath. Philosophers argued about the soul, whether it was eternal, whether it merged with a cosmic absolute, whether it could be purified through knowledge or austerity. Many believed freedom meant uncovering a true self hidden beneath illusion, like a jewel buried in dust. When early Buddhist texts speak of dukkha, they are not merely naming suffering as agony or tragedy. They are pointing to something more pervasive, the inability of conditioned experience to finally satisfy. Even happiness trembles. Even love fears loss. Even identity requires constant maintenance. In this context, nirvana did not arise as an abstract ideal. It arose as a practical answer to a burning question. Is there an end to this cycle? Not just to pain, but to the compulsion that keeps pain returning. The word nirvana itself carried a specific resonance in the language of the time. It meant blowing out, like extinguishing a flame. Not destroying something solid, but removing the conditions that keep it burning. Fire does not go somewhere when it goes out. It simply ceases, because fuel, oxygen, and heat are no longer present. This metaphor mattered. Early Buddhists were surrounded by fire imagery: sacrificial fires, household hearths, forest blazes. Fire was life-giving and dangerous. It warmed, cooked, illuminated, and it consumed. Desire in the early Buddhist vision was not evil. It was combustible. Nirvana, then, was not conceived as a heavenly realm or a perfected state of personality. It was the cessation of burning, the cooling of the heart, the end of compulsive grasping. This is where modern misunderstandings often begin. We are accustomed to thinking in terms of achievement. We climb ladders, we unlock levels, we collect experiences. When we hear of liberation, we imagine a final acquisition, something added to the self, something possessed. The Buddha's insight did not point toward discovering a permanent, purified self. It pointed toward seeing that what we call self is a process. Fragile, reactive, conditioned. Thoughts arise, feelings surge, perceptions shift. Identity is assembled moment by moment, like a fire fed by habit and memory. But early Buddhism was moving in the opposite direction. In the earliest layers of Buddhist teaching, Nirvana is consistently described negatively, not because it is bleak, but because it cannot be captured by ordinary categories. It is spoken of as the absence of greed, hatred, and delusion, as the end of craving, as the unbinding of the mind from compulsive patterns. To reach Nirvana was not to polish this process into perfection. It was to no longer mistake it for something that must be defended, gratified, or completed. Notice what is missing. There is no emphasis on ecstasy, no guarantee of perpetual pleasure, no promise of personal fulfillment in the modern sense. Instead, there is freedom from necessity, freedom from the need for experience to be a certain way, freedom from the reflex, to cling when pleasure arises or resist when pain appears, freedom from the inner command that says this must last or this must stop. For early practitioners, this freedom was not theoretical. It was embodied. Monks and nuns lived with radical simplicity, not because the world was sinful, but because simplicity made craving visible. When you own little, desire has fewer places to hide. When meals are plain, praise is rare, and comfort is inconsistent, the mind reveals its habits with startling clarity. Nirvana was understood as something that could be realized in this very life, not after death, not in another realm. The Buddha did not postpone liberation. He insisted it was possible here and now, in a body that aged, sickened, and died. This is crucial to its historical meaning. Nirvana was not escape from life. It was freedom within life. Even death itself was reinterpreted through this lens. Early texts speak of the arahant, one who has realized nirvana, still walking, eating, teaching, feeling pain, experiencing illness. What had ended was not sensation, but bondage, not feeling, but fixation, not personality, but the belief that personality was a solid refuge. For one who had realized nirvana, death was not a transition to another state of being. It was the final ending of conditions. The flame, already unbound, did not reignite elsewhere. This unsettled many contemporaries who expected liberation to involve eternal existence in some refined form. But early Buddhism was unflinching. Any form of continued grasping, even at existence itself, was seen as fuel. To modern ears, this can sound like annihilation. But that fear arises from a deep assumption that there is a fixed entity being erased. Early Buddhism questioned that assumption at its root. What ends in nirvana is not a someone. What ends is a pattern of craving, a pattern of ignorance, a pattern of mistaking impermanent processes for a self that must be protected and satisfied. This is why Nirvana was spoken of with such restraint. Language itself was seen as inadequate. Words rely on distinctions. This versus that, existence versus non-existence. Nirvana in early Buddhism was understood as lying outside these dualities, not as a mystical fog, but as a reality that does not submit to conceptual grasping. And yet, it was not distant. It was described as the unborn, the unconditioned, the deathless, not because it was a thing, but because it was free from the laws that govern arising and passing away. Everything we normally experience arises due to causes and fades when those causes dissolve. Nirvana was what remains when this mechanism no longer dominates the mind. Not an object of experience, but the ending of compulsion toward experience. This was a radical reorientation. When early Buddhists spoke of peace, they did not mean comfort. They meant the peace of no longer being at war with impermanence, no longer negotiating with reality, no longer demanding guarantees from a world that offers none. It asked practitioners not to improve the contents of life, but to understand the nature of attachment itself, to see with penetrating clarity how suffering is constructed moment by moment, and how, moment by moment, it can cease. Nirvana as unbinding, not escape. Nirvana, historically, was not a promise to make life more exciting. It was an invitation to stop. And in a world as restless as ours, that ancient invitation still hums, quiet, uncompromising, and profoundly compassionate. As early Buddhism matured, the meaning of nirvana did not expand outward into grand cosmology. It refined inward. Like a craftsman sharpening a blade, the tradition became increasingly precise about what nirvana was, and just as importantly, what it was not. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. In the modern imagination, liberation is often imagined spatially. We picture an elsewhere, a higher plane, a luminous realm, a perfected state beyond this flawed world. But in the earliest Buddhist understanding, nirvana was not a place one traveled to. It was a condition that ceased. Early Buddhist teachers were careful with language. They knew how easily the mind turns freedom into an object, something to possess. The moment nirvana is imagined as a thing, a state, a realm, an eternal experience, craving quietly returns, wearing a sacred mask. One begins to want nirvana, to reach for it, to measure progress toward it, and thus the fire is fed again. Instead, nirvana was framed as unbinding. In the ordinary mind, experience is bound tightly together. Sensation binds to feeling, feeling binds to craving, craving binds to action, action binds to identity, identity binds to fear. This binding happens so quickly that it feels seamless, natural, inevitable. We say, I am angry, I am afraid, I am fulfilled, without noticing how many conditions assembled that sentence. The Buddha's insight cut into this knot. He did not deny experience. He did not suppress emotion. He pointed to the invisible glue, the clinging that turns passing phenomena into personal burden. Nirvana was the moment that glue dissolved. This is why early Buddhism described liberation not as becoming something, but as letting go of something that was never secure to begin with. One of the most radical aspects of early Buddhist thought is its refusal to anchor nirvana in metaphysical certainty. When pressed on questions such as whether the liberated one exists after death, or does not exist, or both, or neither, the tradition consistently resisted definitive answers, not out of evasiveness, but out of precision. This was not philosophical hair-splitting. It was a safeguard against turning liberation into belief. Such questions assume a framework, existence versus non-existence, that applies to conditioned things. But nirvana was understood as the ending, of conditions. To ask where a flame goes when it is extinguished is already to misunderstand what fire is. Early Buddhism was deeply pragmatic. The Buddha spoke as a physician speaks: diagnose the illness, identify the cause, offer a treatment, describe the result. Nirvana was the result, the cessation of the illness. One does not argue about where health goes when disease ends. And realization was inseparable from insight into impermanence. What mattered was not theorizing nirvana, but realizing it. In early Buddhist practice, practitioners were guided again and again to observe how everything that arises passes away. Breath, sensation, thought, emotion, perception. Nothing holds still. Even attention itself flickers. At first, this observation can feel unsettling. The mind searches for something solid, something dependable. It finds none. As impermanence becomes undeniable, clinging begins to look irrational. Why grasp what cannot stay? Why define oneself by what is already dissolving? This is not forced renunciation. It is natural release. But slowly, something unexpected happens. This is why early texts speak of nirvana as cooling. Heat, in this context, is agitation, the friction between desire and reality, the constant negotiation, more, less, again, never again. Cooling is not numbness, it is ease, without dependence. Nirvana was described as the mind no longer intoxicated by becoming, no longer chasing continuity where there is none, no longer demanding that experience provide identity. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of nirvana. The liberated mind still feels pleasure, but it does not cling to it. Still feels pain, but does not build a story of resistance around it. Still engages with the world, but without the invisible demand that the world complete it. Modern culture often equates meaning with intensity. We chase peak experiences. We fear neutrality. We imagine freedom as perpetual bliss. But early Buddhism saw this hunger for intensity as another form of bondage, another way craving disguises itself. Nirvana was not an emotional high. It was freedom from needing highs. Early accounts of awakened individuals describe them as calm, attentive, compassionate, and remarkably ordinary. They taught, they begged for food, they washed their robes, they aged. What had changed was not their humanity, but their relationship to it. The self, as a project, had ended. This brings us to one of the most challenging dimensions of early Buddhist nirvana, its relationship to non-self. In the spiritual traditions surrounding early Buddhism, liberation was often framed as realizing the true self, an eternal essence, identical with the cosmos or divine principle. Early Buddhism took a different turn. It did not deny experience, but it denied ownership. When practitioners looked closely, they found no permanent core behind thoughts, feelings, or perceptions. Everything was contingent, responsive, shaped by causes. The sense of I was not an entity, but a habit of identification. When there is no fixation on me and mine, there is more room for others, more patience, more responsiveness, less defensiveness. This is difficult to hear, especially in cultures that prize individuality. But early Buddhism was not nihilistic. It did not erase personality or ethical responsibility. On the contrary, compassion deepened precisely because suffering was no longer filtered through self-concern. Nirvana, then, was not the liberation of a self. It was liberation from the assumption of self. Nirvana was inseparable from compassion, not because compassion was commanded, but because the barriers that obstruct it had fallen. This is why nirvana was sometimes spoken of as something to be entered, and sometimes as something to be realized. Language bent under the weight of experience. Importantly, early Buddhism did not present nirvana as all or nothing in daily experience. While full liberation was described as a decisive shift, the path toward it was gradual. Each moment of reduced clinging was a taste of freedom. Each insight into impermanence loosened the grip of suffering. To be free was to let phenomena arise and pass without turning them into identity. To live without leaning on what cannot hold weight. Early Buddhists did not seek to disappear. They sought to stop being compelled. What remained consistent was this: Nirvana was never an escape from reality. It was intimacy with reality, without resistance. In this sense, Nirvana was profoundly this-worldly. It did not deny the conditions of existence. It denied their tyranny. And perhaps this is why its meaning has endured. Because even now, centuries later, amid technology and noise, ambition and distraction, the same question persists, quietly, insistently. Is there a way to be fully present without grasping? To love without clinging? To act without being driven by fear of loss? Is it possible to live without burning? Early Buddhism answered not with promises, but with a demonstration. Nirvana was not an idea to believe in. It was a fire that could go out if one was willing to stop feeding it. To speak of nirvana historically, without speaking of practice, would be to leave the story unfinished. In early Buddhism, nirvana was never meant to remain a distant or abstract horizon. It was not preserved for philosophers or mystics alone. It was woven into daily discipline, ethical restraint, meditation, and careful attention to the mind as it actually behaves. Nirvana lived. Practice, realization, and the end of becoming. Nirvana was not discovered by thinking about life, but by watching it relentlessly, patiently, honestly. Early Buddhist practice was grounded in a simple yet demanding act: seeing clearly, seeing how suffering arises, seeing how it fades, seeing how the mind habitually interferes with its own peace. Over time, the answers became undeniable. The Buddha's path was not built on belief, but on observation. Practitioners were encouraged to look directly at their experience and test the teachings against reality. Does craving lead to ease or tension? Does clinging bring security or fear? Does letting go diminish life or open it? This constant movement toward and away from experience created restlessness. The mind was never at home, always leaning forward or recoiling back. Nirvana was the ending of this leaning. In early meditation practice, attention was trained to remain with immediate experience: the breath, the body, sensations, states of mind, not to control them, but to know them. As awareness sharpened, the mechanics of suffering revealed themselves. A pleasant feeling arose, and almost instantly, desire followed. An unpleasant sensation appeared, and aversion surged. A neutral moment passed unnoticed, dismissed as unimportant. When these misreadings were corrected, craving lost its footing. As insight deepened, practitioners saw that craving did not arise because things were pleasant or unpleasant. It arose because of ignorance, a misreading of experience. Pleasure was mistaken for permanence. Pain was mistaken for threat. Neutrality was mistaken for emptiness. This is why early Buddhism emphasized wisdom alongside concentration. Calm alone was not enough. One could still cling to calm, still identify with peace, still fear disturbance. Nirvana required insight into the impermanent, unsatisfactory, and selfless nature of all conditioned phenomena, not as concepts, but as lived realities. When this insight matured, something fundamental shifted. The mind no longer chased after becoming. It no longer sought to solidify itself through roles, achievements, or even spiritual identities. The endless project of making a self collapsed, not violently, but gently, like a structure no longer being repaired, because its necessity had been seen through. This collapse was nirvana. These words can sound stark, even bleak, to modern ears. But in their original context, they were quietly triumphant. They meant that the cycle of compulsive becoming had stopped. No more striving to be something. No more fear of becoming nothing. This is perhaps the most radical freedom early Buddhism offered. Early texts often describe this moment with striking restraint. There are no visions of light, no proclamations of cosmic unity. Instead, there is a simple knowing. Birth is ended. The holy life has been lived. There is nothing further to be done. Nirvana ended this temporal captivity, not by erasing memory or foresight, but by dissolving the identification that bound identity to them. Past and future became tools, not prisons. The present was no longer a means to an end. It was sufficient. Most of human suffering arises not from pain itself, but from our relationship to time. We are haunted by the past and anxious about the future. We carry stories of who we were and fantasies of who we must become. The present moment is rarely allowed to stand on its own. Early Buddhism saw ethical conduct not as a moral command, but as a natural expression of freedom. When greed and hatred are absent, harm does not arise. When delusion fades, wisdom guides action effortlessly. Importantly, nirvana did not render one inactive. On the contrary, action became clearer, less distorted by self-interest. Compassion flowed more freely, because it was no longer entangled with the need for recognition or reward. This is why early Buddhist accounts of liberated individuals often emphasize equanimity, not indifference, but balance. A mind no longer pulled apart by preference, no longer fragmented by hope and fear. This is why nirvana was sometimes described as the end of karma, not the end of action, but the end of action driven by craving and ignorance. Actions continued, but they no longer planted seeds of future suffering. Thus, nirvana was not withdrawal from the world, but a different way of inhabiting it. The liberated one still experienced the world of sights and sounds, praise and blame, gain and loss. But these experiences no longer defined them. They no longer left residue, like writing on water. They appeared and vanished without trace. No savior intervened. No grace descended. The mind awakened to its own patterns and stepped out of them. Here again, early Buddhism diverged sharply from many religious traditions. Liberation was not a reward granted by an external power. It was the natural consequence of understanding. When the causes of suffering were removed, suffering ceased. This view placed immense responsibility and immense dignity in human awareness. Nirvana required honesty, not aggression. Yet this was not a cold or mechanical process. It was infused with care. The Buddha consistently emphasized gentleness, patience, and compassion in practice. Harsh striving was seen as another form of craving. Self-punishment was just another attempt to control reality. It required the courage to sit still with discomfort and not immediately react. The humility to see how often the mind lies to itself. The patience to let understanding mature at its own pace. It was known by what was absent, and when it emerged, it did not announce itself with spectacle. This is why early Buddhist practice was often compared to cultivation rather than conquest. One prepared the soil, removed weeds, planted seeds, and waited. Nirvana could not be forced. It emerged when conditions were complete. No more compulsion to defend identity. No more reflexive craving. No more fear of impermanence. The mind rested, not because it had found something eternal to cling to, but because it no longer needed to cling at all. A mistake repeated moment by moment, believing that peace lies in holding on. This was the historical nirvana of early Buddhism. Not an altered state, not an eternal self, not a transcendent realm, but the ending of a mistake. As the fire dies down, the night grows vast. Not empty, simply quiet. In that quiet, early Buddhism placed its trust, not in promises of becoming more, but in the courage to stop becoming altogether. The historical meaning of nirvana was never meant to dazzle. It was meant to liberate. It pointed not toward an extraordinary escape, but toward an ordinary freedom so subtle it is often overlooked. The freedom of no longer being compelled by craving, no longer being ruled by fear of loss, no longer mistaking impermanent patterns for a self that must be defended. When that belief ended, peace remained, quiet, unadorned, and deeply human. In a world that urges us constantly to acquire, achieve, and assert, this teaching remains quietly radical. It does not ask us to abandon life, but to meet it without grasping, to feel fully without clinging, to love without ownership, to act without the weight of becoming someone in return. If these words have touched something in you, a weariness, a curiosity, a quiet recognition, let that be enough for now. Understanding unfolds slowly, like dawn. There is no urgency, only attention. Early Buddhism offered nirvana, not as a distant hope, but as a present possibility, accessible in any moment where clinging ends, even briefly. In such moments, the heart cools, the mind rests, and something deeply human remembers how to be at ease. May your steps be gentle. If you wish to continue walking this path of reflection, stillness, and insight, you are welcome to follow this channel. Here, we sit together with ancient wisdom, not to escape the world, but to see it clearly and to suffer a little less within it. May your mind grow quiet. May the fire, when ready, be allowed to rest.